Ask any veteran rocker and they'll tell you that going on tour can end in tragedy. From bus accidents to plane crashes to other dangerous mishaps, these bands' tours were anything but magical.
On September 27, 1986, Metallica was in Sweden promoting their latest release, Master of Puppets. They were heading to their next tour date when, just before 7 a.m., their driver skidded on a patch of black ice and lost control. The tour bus flipped and threw bassist Cliff Burton through a window. What happened next is told differently by people on the scene, but they do all agree that the bus landed on top of Burton and killed the 24-year-old musician. There were questions as to whether the accident could have been prevented, but an investigation cleared the driver of any wrongdoing. In a bizarre footnote, Burton was sleeping on a top bunk when the accident happened, and he'd ended up there because of a single draw from a deck of cards. He and guitarist Kirk Hammett drew cards to see who was going to get the pick of the bunks, and Burton won with the ace of spades. He chose the bunk that Hammett had been using, and that choice ultimately led to his death.
I still miss Cliff, no doubt, and I'd love to see him again at some point.
Stevie Ray Vaughan's 136th show In Step tour kicked off on May 4th, 1989. It ended with an epic outing featuring Eric Clapton, but that was followed by a tragic helicopter accident that took away one of music's most respected guitarists. After the show at Wisconsin's Alpine Valley Musical Theater, a group of 4 helicopters were on hand to fly the performers back to their Chicago hotel. One of the choppers had been reserved for Vaughan, his brother Jimmy, and Jimmy's wife Connie. Some of Clapton's entourage was already on board though, so Stevie asked Jimmy and Connie if he could take the last seat. It was only the next morning that reports started to go out that the chopper had never reached its destination, and when friends found Vaughan's hotel room empty, they suspected the worst. Shortly after 7 a.m., Jimmy was called and asked to identify his brother's body. Stevie Ray Vaughan, along with everyone else on the chopper, had died only half a mile into the flight when the pilot banked sharply in the fog and collided with a ski slope. Eerily, only the day before, Vaughan had shared a disturbing dream with his bandmates in which he was a witness to his own funeral. He was only 35 when he died. The end of 2014 was a bad time for the Celtic punk band Dropkick Murphys. On November 13th, lead singer Al Barr received word that a childhood friend had passed away. He announced to fans that he was going to be unable to make their next scheduled show in Tulsa, Oklahoma, as he would be flying out to attend his friend's funeral. But to add to the tragedy, the band never made it to the airport. Instead, they announced that they were canceling their Tulsa show after their tour bus hit and killed a pedestrian who had run into the highway in front of them. The Boston Globe later identified the man as a 23-year-old father of 1. The band expressed their condolences and requested that their fans keep the man's family in their prayers. The family returned the sentiment with sympathies to all the band members involved and to the bus driver. Black Sabbath had given Ozzy Osbourne the boot in 1979, but by the early 80s, things were sort of back on track. Part of the credit for that should go to guitarist Randy Rhoads, so it's unsurprising that the Crazy Train singer is still haunted by the bizarre accident that killed Rhoads in 1982. On March 19th, bus driver Andrew Aycock, who had an expired pilot's license, hopped in a small 1955 Beechcraft Bonanza plane with Rhoads and a woman named Rachel Youngblood. With Osbourne and the rest of his band asleep on the tour bus, Aycock buzzed the bus a few times before losing control, hitting a tree, and crashing into a house. Aycock, Rhoads, and Youngblood were all killed instantly. The incident had a lasting impact on the other band members, particularly bassist Rudy Sarzo, who parted ways with Ozzy and returned to the band Quiet Riot after the accident. Sarzo later spoke out about how difficult it was to go on stage without Rhoads. Because of that pain, he chose to leave a hugely successful band so that he could enjoy playing again. It was Ozzy's wife Sharon Osbourne who pushed the band to move on. Within a week and a half, they were back on tour with replacement guitarist Bernie Torme, but memories of Randy Rhoads continue to live on.
I think about him a lot still. I often think where he would be in the picture if he was still around. He was just a great guy.
Gary Numan, the musician best known for the 1979 new wave hit Cars, is still touring and recording new music. In 2018, he announced that he was going to tour to support his 22nd album, Savage: Songs from a Broken World. That was in April, and in September, he canceled a show at the Cleveland House of Blues after his tour bus was involved in a tragic accident. The bus was making a right turn when it collided with a 91-year-old man who had been pushing a cart through a crosswalk. The man died at the scene and was given last rites by a priest from a nearby church. Numan canceled the show and issued a statement that read in part, "We are utterly devastated by the fatal accident involving our tour bus earlier today. Every one of us is filled with a sadness that made it impossible to even consider playing our show this evening, and out of respect, it would have been entirely wrong. At the moment, all we can think about are the people affected by this terrible tragedy, and to them, we send our love." Lynyrd Skynyrd's iconic 1977 album Street Survivors had hit shelves only a few days before the band members boarded their leased 30-year-old plane in spite of many misgivings. They'd already played 5 shows on the tour, and it had gone well. They had plans to upgrade their old Convair 240 to a Learjet, and their 600-mile flight from Greenville, South Carolina to Baton Rouge, Louisiana was supposed to be one of their last trips in the Convair. And it was, but not for the reasons they thought. Survivors of the accident said that nearly everyone on board had reservations about the trip. Those concerns were amplified by the fact that just a few days earlier, flames had been seen spitting from one of the engines. But lead vocalist Ronnie Van Zant was adamant that they move forward, pushing everyone with these fateful words. Hey, if the Lord wants you to die on this plane, when it's your time, it's your time. Let's go, man. We've got a gig to do. The plane ran out of fuel towards the end of the flight. The pilots attempted an emergency landing, but ended up crashing into a large tree. Van Zant, guitarist-vocalist Steve Gaines, and his sister, backing vocalist Cassie Gaines, all lost their lives in the Mississippi swamps. Strangely, Van Zant had been convinced that he would die before he turned 30, and he was indeed just a few months shy of his 30th birthday when the plane went down. There's no denying that a single decision can change the course of an entire life, and for Reba McEntire, that decision happened in 1991. She and her band had finished a show in San Diego and were heading to their next gig. She decided to spend one more night along with her husband and stylist in California, while the others went on ahead in 2 separate planes. One plane arrived, but tragedy struck the other one as it carried 8 of McEntire's closest friends and bandmates. One of the plane's wings clipped a rock protruding from the side of Otay Mountain. No one survived the crash. Other country music superstars stepped up, even offering to give McEntire their own backing band so she could continue on and finish her tour, though she declined. She continued to memorialize the crash and remember those she lost, dedicating her next album, For My Broken Heart, to those who died in the crash. She visited the crash site on the 25th anniversary of the tragedy and posted a message on Facebook. I feel in my heart that they know we still miss them so much. My love and prayers to all the families and friends.
I mean, if you've got somebody you love, you better tell them, because things can happen in an instant to change your life.
Some people are fortunate and determined enough to turn a tragedy into something good, and that's exactly what Gloria Estefan has managed to do. In 1990, she was headed for Syracuse, New York, when her tour bus was rear-ended. She broke her back and was told there was a very good chance she would never walk again, much less get on stage and dance. Years later, Estefan talked frankly about the accident on Oprah's Next Chapter.
Those things can either tear you apart.
Yeah, it tears most people apart.
It does, because it's hard to handle.
Estefan gives her husband Emilio a huge amount of credit toward aiding in her recovery, which included 9 months of therapy every day for 7 hours a day. She was up and out of bed every 45 minutes, not because her therapy called for it, but because she was in too much pain to sleep. She came to this conclusion.
This was the whole point of me becoming famous, to now go through something like this in the public eye.
Estefan has gone on to do charity work, campaigning, and fundraising, all in hopes of furthering medical research done on spinal cord injuries and paralysis. Trace Adkins was already at the CenturyTel Center in Bossier City, Louisiana in 2010 for his scheduled show when he got the news that his tour bus had been involved in a horrific accident just north of Shreveport. The bus had collided head-on with a Ford F-250 truck. 5 members of Adkins' band who were on the bus suffered only minor injuries. However, the 2 men who were in the truck were killed. According to the official investigation, the truck had been swerving as it approached the bus, and the bus driver was unable to avoid it. Ultimately, the cause of the accident was ruled to be driver fatigue. The men in the truck had been up for around 24 hours at the point of the accident and were on their way home from an all-nighter at a nearby casino. Adkins played a scaled-down version of his show following the accident and canceled his following show in Pensacola, Florida. In 2015, metalcore band The Ghost Inside were on their way from a gig in Texas to their next show in Phoenix when they were involved in a catastrophic accident. They were just outside El Paso when a truck hit their tour bus head-on. At first, details were sketchy. NME reported that the bus driver and one person in the other vehicle had been killed, while drummer Andrew Tkachuk had been seriously injured. In the immediate aftermath, Andrew's brother Nick said that Andrew had suffered head trauma, a shoulder injury, and broken bones. It later came out that Andrew had spent 10 days in a coma and had one of his legs amputated. It wasn't until 2018 that it was reported that it might be possible that the group would play again. Tkachuk had been fitted with a prosthetic that wasn't ideal for playing, but his father built a device that adapted his drums to his missing leg.
As both a guitarist extraordinaire and a constant presence on the rock scene since the 1960s, Eric Clapton has pretty much seen it all. But old Slowhand's success has come with a great number of personal demons. His appetite for drink and drugs used to be copious, to say the least, and for a long time, he refused to even admit that he was an addict. On his 1981 U.S. tour, things came to a head in a dramatic way. On March 13th of that year, Clapton had just wrapped up a show in Wisconsin when suddenly a brutal pain hit him. He later wrote in his autobiography, "I was diagnosed with 5 bleeding ulcers. One was the size of a small orange. The doctors told Roger Forrester, who wanted to fly me back to England, that I could die at any moment since one of the ulcers was pressing on my pancreas and could burst imminently." Clapton ultimately pulled through and was able to return to work after a quite literally sobering stint in the hospital. Unfortunately, he soon hit the bottle once more. In fact, Clapton didn't fully sober up until after his son's death in 1991. David Bowie's career was filled with great art and even greater music, so maybe it's unsurprising that even his death in 2016 came with a soundtrack of sorts, his final album, Black Star. However, both Bowie's career and life almost had a far more premature ending. Bowie wasn't one of those artists who toured the globe well into their 60s, and there was a very good reason for that. During his A Reality tour in 2004, a blocked artery gave him a serious health scare after a show in Germany, and although emergency surgery saved him, the incident caused Bowie to consider ending his career altogether. Bowie was 57 at the time, and although he appeared as ageless and animated as ever, his band had started to notice that he wasn't all that well. He had already started displaying symptoms during an earlier date in the Czech Republic, but it wasn't until the June 25th gig at the Hurricane Festival when things really took a dark turn. Bowie's guitar player, Jerry Lynyrd, later said, "We played the entire set and it seemed normal, not quite as energetic and as charged as the performance before. We finished the show and then it seemed like David was in a lot of pain, and obviously something was wrong." Though Bowie survived the ordeal and carried on with his recording career, his touring days had at long last come to an end. Metallica singer-guitarist James Hetfield has had 2 brushes with death on tour. The first happened on September 26, 1986, when the thrash metal giants were caught in a bus accident in Sweden on their European tour. The crash killed Metallica's bassist, Cliff Burton, although the other band members escaped with just a few injuries. Hetfield's second close call was in 1992, when Metallica were co-headlining a tour with Guns N' Roses. In Montreal, a miscommunication with a pyrotechnician led to a situation in which Hetfield was far too close to a magnesium flame when it went off. Hetfield later recalled,
So I'm burnt, all my arm, my hand completely down to the bone. The side of my face, hair gone.
Luckily, Hetfield survived this painful ordeal, and the band resumed touring a few weeks later, though it was a while before he played guitar again. To put in context just how close Hetfield came to losing his life, the band's bassist Jason Newsted later pointed out, if he had been breathing in, he would have been dead. Guns N' Roses are pretty much the poster boys for rock and roll excess, but even so, guitarist Slash's close call in a San Francisco hotel during one tour in 1992 is almost too strange to believe. Predictably, drugs were involved. Less predictably, however, this overdose actually did kill him. Slash's heart reportedly stopped for no fewer than 8 minutes until paramedics were able to revive him. That may sound like an impossible amount of time to go without a heartbeat, but the length of time that a heart can be stopped before a person is considered beyond saving depends on a number of variables. So who knows? Of course, you might expect that temporarily dying in the middle of a tour would be a pretty daunting experience for somebody. But as Slash tells the tale, being dead for a considerable period of time didn't faze him all that much. He later told The Guardian, "They took me to the hospital, but I said, I'm fine, signed myself out, went back to the hotel, and we flew to the next gig." Phil Anselmo's heyday as the frontman of groove metal titans Pantera had no shortage of drama. Notably, Anselmo almost died of a heroin overdose in 1996 during the band's Great Southern Trendkill tour. According to Anselmo himself, his heroin use was a natural extension from the various painkillers he'd used to manage a serious and painful back condition called degenerative disc disease. The singer's own eventual statement about the incident made it clear just how close he'd been to death's door. Anselmo said, "I, Philip H. Anselmo, immediately after a very successful show in Dallas, injected a lethal dose of heroin into my arm and died for 4 to 5 minutes. In his statement, Anselmo promised to keep Pantera's tour going and keep himself in the land of the living. December 1971 was a bad month for Frank Zappa. On December 4th, the artist and his Mothers of Invention band inadvertently inspired Deep Purple's hit song Smoke on the Water when a fan decided to whip out a flare gun during their show at Montreux Casino in Geneva, Switzerland. The ensuing fire quickly became an inferno that burned the whole building down. Fortunately, there were no casualties or even serious injuries, thanks in part to the heroics of concert organizer Claude Nobbs and reportedly Zappa himself, who smashed a window with his guitar to help people escape. Then, just 6 days later, the band was playing the Rainbow Theatre in London when a fan rushed the stage, reportedly in a fit of jealousy over his girlfriend's Zappa infatuation, and pushed the singer off. Zappa's fall into the orchestra pit crushed his larynx and gave him chronic back pain, along with an assortment of grievous injuries. He later wrote, "The band thought I was dead. My head was over on my shoulder and my neck was bent like it was broken. I had a gash on my chin, a hole in the back of my head, a broken rib, and a fractured leg. One arm was paralyzed." Zappa ended up spending the next year in a wheelchair. In 1978, The Who's Buck Wild drummer Keith Moon died after an accidental overdose at only 32 years old. But that was far from his first OD. On November 20th, 1973, The Who played the first gig of their U.S. tour in San Francisco. In the end, however, the band was forced to enlist a crowd member named Scott Halpin to finish the show, as Moon had taken a pretty big dose of ketamine to help calm his nerves. He stopped playing and then passed out partway through Won't Get Fooled Again, before being helped off stage by the band's roadies. Halpin played 3 songs with The Who, while Moon was revived backstage. Unfortunately, Halpin wasn't around to rescue the band on March 9, 1976, when Moon was once again unable to play a gig, this time at the Boston Garden. The concert had to be stopped and rescheduled, and although Moon's troubles were initially explained away as a debilitating case of flu, it was later revealed that he had ingested a near-lethal amount of brandy and barbiturates. Lead singer Roger Daltrey told Howard Stern,
"And a lot of the stuff that he did that people laugh about, they think, oh, that was really funny.
Yeah.
When you were there at the time, some of it wasn't funny at all."
In 1995, alt-rock superstars R.E.M. toured the globe in support of their album Monster, but the tour turned out to be a deeply unpleasant experience for several band members. Bassist Mike Mills had a tumor scare, for example, while Michael Stipe had to have surgery for a hernia. But the first and worst of the tour's many problems came for drummer Bill Berry, who almost died of a brain aneurysm. A March show in Lausanne, Switzerland proved difficult for Berry, who started to feel a nasty pain in his head and eventually had to leave the stage when it pretty much knocked him out. He later described the experience to the LA Times, saying, "It felt like a bowling ball hit me in the head. There wasn't any warning. I was just singing the falsetto part on tongue when it happened." Berry was later diagnosed with not just 1 but 2 brain aneurysms, one of which had already ruptured. Fortunately, this daunting situation had a happy ending. Berry was rushed into surgery, which proved successful, and R.E.M. was able to resume touring by May of that year. Still, although the drummer reportedly made a full recovery, the experience might have caused him to reevaluate his life and career. Berry left the band on good terms in 1997, saying that his priorities had simply shifted. Headbanging on stage might be a fairly significant part of Korn vocalist Jonathan Davis's job description, but in 2006, a strange blood condition turned this routine metal move into a potential tragedy. Several of the band's tour dates in Europe that year went down the drain when Davis started to notice strange marks on his skin that left his body looking literally beat up. Describing the symptoms, the singer later recalled, "We had just done a show in Hamburg, Germany. I was on the bus and noticed all this bruising all over my body. It wasn't bad, just here and there, but I was like, what the hell? This ain't right. I don't remember hitting myself or anything, and I never bruise." The bruises eventually turned out to be a full-on blood infection, brought on by a blood disorder called thrombocytopenic purpura, or ITP for short. This condition can kick in when your blood platelets are too low, and it stops your blood from clotting normally, causing internal bleeding and bruising, as well as potential hemorrhages. As a result, if Davis had been too cavalier with his headbanging, he may well have wound up in a very bad way indeed. The singer's ITP reportedly stemmed from an allergic reaction and was itself nearly fatal. Fortunately, he was quickly seen by a doctor and made it to a hospital just in time. The year was 1977, and poet turned punk rock trailblazer Patti Smith's band was touring as a support act for a far more traditional rocker, Bob Seger. But this tour would have drastic and long-lasting consequences for Smith. During a concert in Tampa, Florida, she fell off the stage and suffered a number of horrific spinal injuries. Impeded by a broken neck vertebrae and a fractured spine, her fall sidelined Smith's career for a long time, and recovery required both a large amount of physical therapy and a lengthy stint with a neck brace. The accident reportedly happened when Smith spun on the stage and lost her footing. Though she and her career ultimately recovered, in 2012, Smith told Uncut that her back was still bothering her even decades later, and that she felt Seger's crew was to blame. She said, "I was being careful on the stage because there wasn't as much room or light. I didn't whirl around as much as usual, but when I hit the monitor with my foot, it was half hanging over the lip of the stage. We needed more space and light, and we didn't get it, and I had an accident." Keith Richards is so notorious for cheating death that there's a somewhat well-known saying in the world of rock and roll that he and cockroaches would be the only living things to survive a nuclear war. As the late great Robin Williams put it,
"He is the only man on the planet who can go anthrax." All right.
The Rolling Stones guitarist had one of his earlier near-death experiences way back in 1965, when the Stones were bringing their music to America. A December 3rd concert in Sacramento, California was business as usual, right up until the point at which the guitarist's instrument connected with a microphone stand. A large number of sparks and one stunned guitarist flew as a surge of electricity knocked Richards out in the most dramatic way possible. The mic stand had been ungrounded, and the ensuing electrical shock nearly killed Richards. One audience member later described the events, saying, "I saw the blue light. I literally saw Keith fly into the air backward. I thought he was dead. I was horrified. We all were." Silence fell over the crowd. Fortunately, Richards had been wearing a pair of rubber-soled boots that day, which may have been instrumental in saving his life. In a textbook example of his ability to survive basically anything, Richards was back on stage the very next day. In 1993, Radiohead was a very different band from the arty and experimental outfit they are today. Riding high on the wave of their grunge-influenced album Pablo Honey, they spent the summer of that year touring the US, and on Independence Day performed for the show MTV Beach House. But this holiday nearly ended in tragedy after Thom Yorke took a dip in a nearby swimming pool. As the band performed the song Anyone Can Play Guitar, Yorke gave a wild performance that culminated with him diving headfirst into the pool. He then climbed out again and immediately reached for a live microphone, whilst soaking wet. Fortunately, someone had the presence of mind to quickly take the mic out of the singer's reach. The incident doesn't show up on the aired version of the show, in which you can only briefly see Yorke urgently conferring with a crew member after climbing out of the water. But if the story is true, it's probably fair to say that Yorke owes that person his life. Charlie Puth's musical output may not be the heaviest in the world, but during his career he has worked with a number of rock icons, including Ozzy Osbourne and Slash. And if nothing else, Puth's touring schedule alone seems to be far more metal than most, considering that it has reportedly almost killed him twice. Puth got his start as a YouTube star in 2009, and eventually hit the mainstream both as a songwriter for other artists and as a singer-songwriter in his own right. Unfortunately, hitting the road didn't come quite so easily for Puth. In 2019, he recalled, "I used to get sick a lot on tour. I almost died twice, like literally. It was really tough. I kept getting sick. I was sick for like a year with a cold, and I just wasn't really taking care of myself." Puth didn't go into specifics about precisely what kind of health problems he had faced, but he did say that he eventually came to understand how you can live life on the road without having to suffer. He said, "Now I know how to tour. I figured it out." Sometimes a rock star doesn't even need to be on tour to be thrown into peril. All it takes is one bad day. Few know this better than Travis Barker of Blink-182 fame. In September 2008, the duo project of Barker and his friend Adam DJ AM Goldstein performed a one-off free concert in South Carolina. Afterward, they were set to fly back to California, but unfortunately, their Learjet's takeoff ended in a crash that killed 4 people on board. Only the 2 musicians survived. Barker told Joe Rogan just how terrible it was.
I was in such a hurry to get out of the plane and exit the plane, I jumped right into the jet, which is full of fuel, so my whole body lit up.
Barker was left in critical condition by the crash, with over 65% of his body badly burned. The drummer's road to recovery included 27 surgeries and was so arduous that at one point, he openly offered $1 million to any friend who would be willing to end his pain. Barker eventually regained the will to live, but, rather understandably, has preferred to avoid flying ever since.
Otis Redding, the 26-year-old well driller turned megastar, died not long after unseating Elvis Presley as the Melody Maker's top male vocalist. He was seeing the fruits of his labors, too. The tour that he died on was the first tour where he was using his own newly purchased private plane. Redding and his backing group, the Bar-Kays, were only 4 miles from their destination, the Madison Municipal Airport in Madison, Wisconsin, when the plane crashed into a nearby lake. The area was covered with fog, and days later, rescue divers were still dredging the lake, trying to recover any possible survivors of the crash. There was one survivor, Ben Cawley. A seat cushion saved his life, and he, along with fellow Bar-Kay member James Alexander, who was on another plane, rebuilt the group and later toured with Isaac Hayes, Aretha Franklin, and the Doobie Brothers. Any accident like this is terrible, but the deaths of the Bar-Kays were particularly heartbreaking as they were still in high school. In fact, according to Billboard, some were so young they needed permission slips from their parents to miss school and go on the tour. There's a footnote here too. CL Tampa Bay says the accident came just 3 days after Redding recorded what would be one of his most iconic songs, Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay. As it turns out, some details of the famous recording were actually released unfinished.
The whistling at the end of that song? Well, that was because he always intended to go back in and add more lyrics after that trip to Cleveland, never getting the chance.
In the late 1950s, Eddie Cochran's bouncy guitar and raspy vocals helped write the blueprint for the first wave of rock and roll. While still in his teens, Cochran repeatedly hit the upper reaches of the pop chart with his songs about partying and youthful frustration, particularly Summertime Blues and Come On Everybody. According to history, Cochran's rougher-edged rock and roll remained popular in the UK in the 1960s, after softer pop had supplanted the genre on the US charts. The trends across the pond prompted Cochran and fellow early rock and roll star Gene Vincent to go on tour in the UK. The shows proved so popular that Cochran and Vincent added an additional 10 weeks' worth of performances. On April 16, 1960, the duo played a concert in Bristol and hired a cab to drive them to the London airport. The driver lost control on a windy section of highway late at night near Chippenham and hit a lamppost. Vincent suffered a collarbone injury while Cochran was thrown out of the car upon impact. Hours later, he died from the effects of a head injury. He was just 21 years old. According to Rolling Stone, folksy singer-songwriter Jim Croce had given up on music and gotten a job in construction after his early album Jim and Ingrid Croce flopped. Fortunately for music listeners, ABC Dunhill Records gave him a second chance, signing Croce to record a couple of singles. Both songs, You Don't Mess Around with Jim and Operator, reached the top 20 of the pop chart in 1972. The success prompted the recording of a full-length album and led to Croce achieving a #1 hit with Bad Bad Leroy Brown in April 1973. Just 6 months later, Croce was dead. According to the Associated Press, Croce booked a string of concerts at colleges in 1973, and after playing a show at Northwestern Louisiana University, he and his band boarded a small chartered plane to make it to their next show in Sherman, Texas. Unable to reach a safe altitude, the plane crashed right after takeoff, striking a tree 250 feet past the runway. 6 people in the vehicle died, including Croce's opening act, comedian George Stevens, guitarist Maurice Muleisen, manager Dennis Rast, booking agent Kenneth Dominic Cortez, pilot Robert Newton Elliott, and Croce himself. The singer was just 30 years old. In the late 2010s, Hers was an indie rock duo on the rise.
Everything they were doing was looking great, so there's just a lot of buzz around that band and someone we really believed in.
Featured on BBC Introducing, they released their first record, Invitation to Hers, in 2018, which was well received by indie rock fans in the US and the UK. Hers was comprised of Stephen Fitzpatrick and Auden Loading, who met while attending the Liverpool Institute of the Performing Arts. Rock critics enjoyed the band, with The Guardian likening them to the Smiths and Aztec Camera. In 2019, according to CNN, Hers embarked on a 19-day tour across the United States. On March 26, the duo played a show in Phoenix and embarked on the more than 300-mile journey to their next tour date, Santa Ana, California. In the early morning hours of March 27th, the group's vehicle was involved in a head-on collision with a pickup truck. The driver of the truck died, as did all 3 people in the van, both 24-year-old Fitzpatrick and 25-year-old Lodine of Hers and their tour manager. Rick Nelson was one of the very first rock and roll stars. He was also the prototypical musical teen idol, crooning instant hits each week on The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, the long-running sitcom he starred in alongside his family. After a string of hits in the late 1950s like I'm Walking, Poor Little Fool, and Lonesome Town, Nelson had a major comeback hit with the bitter country rock lament Garden Party.
They didn't accept him, so he wrote a song that kicked their butts.
According to the New York Times, following a December 1985 show in Guntersville, Alabama, Nelson and his band took the musician's DC-3 airplane to Dallas, where they were to play a New Year's Eve gig at the Park Suite Hotel. Eyewitnesses saw the plane circling above the northeastern Texas town of DeKalb. Responding to the ominous activities, the Texas Department of Public Safety dispatched a helicopter to assist, and Nelson's pilot reported an onboard fire and that he needed to make an emergency landing. Moments later, the plane, engulfed in flames, careened into a forest and hit a power line on the way down, causing the aircraft to explode upon hitting the trees. The pilot and co-pilot survived, albeit badly burned. 7 passengers all died, including a 45-year-old Nelson, his fiancée, and his band. February 3, 1959 was forever immortalized as the day the music died, and for good reason. On that day, a horrible plane crash claimed the lives of the legendary rock and roll pioneers Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and J.P. Richardson Jr., better known as the Big Bopper. They had just finished playing a show in Iowa as part of their Winter Dance Party tour, a series of shows that was riddled with notoriously poor traveling conditions. According to The Independent, they were faced with a 400-mile journey to their next gig, and no one wanted to make the trip on their freezing, malfunctioning tour bus. Holly decided to charter a private plane, but there were only so many seats. Holly took one, Valens won another on a coin toss, and another musician, Waylon Jennings, gave his seat to Richardson, who was suffering from the flu. For the rest of his life, Jennings would be haunted by the good-natured but, in hindsight, horrible exchange he had with Holly just before the plane took off. Holly jokingly said, "I hope your damned bus freezes up again." In response, Jennings quipped, "I hope your old plane crashes." There were no survivors. Combining hard rock, punk, and emo, Bayside helped create and capture the definitive sound of the early 2000s. As All Music reports, the band formed in the Bayside neighborhood of Queens, New York in 2000. They quickly released a couple of EPs before signing with Victory Records and putting out their first 2 full-length albums. In 2005, their self-titled LP became the band's first release to hit the Billboard album chart, not the easiest feat for an alternative band on an indie label. Weeks later, Bayside's tour took them through the American West. While heading to a show in Salt Lake City as a support act for Hawthorne Heights, their van encountered an icy section of highway near Cheyenne, Wyoming. The vehicle flipped and landed on its roof. Bassist Nick Gambarian and drum tech Dan Marino were severely injured, hospitalized with broken backs, and needed surgery. Drummer John Beats Houlihan died as a result of injuries suffered in the accident. He was 31 years old. Ultra-smooth, utterly sophisticated soft rock had a big cultural moment in the late 1970s, and few embody that era more than Chuck Mangione. He's one of the few players of the flugelhorn, a brass instrument related to the trumpet, to ever achieve major pop success, according to the Washington Post. What's more, he achieved this feat with Feels So Good, a lyrics-free, easy listening jam with a hokey melody played by Mangione himself, and accompanied by some funky, disco-adjacent rhythm and bass. It went to number 4 on the pop chart and was the first of many times Mangione would score on the adult contemporary chart. On the evening of February 12, 2009, according to the CBC, a flight departed from Newark, New Jersey, in the direction of Buffalo Niagara International Airport in New York. Among the 49 passengers were Gary Nywood and Coleman Mellett, saxophone player and guitarist in Chuck Mangione's backing and touring band. They were scheduled to play with Mangione in the Buffalo Philharmonic, a show that was canceled after the musician's plane crashed into a residence outside Buffalo. According to NPR, all 49 passengers died, including 64-year-old Nywood, who'd played with Mangione in the 60s and 70s, and 33-year-old Mellett. In the mid-1990s, dance pop duo La Bouche scored a string of hits in Europe and the US with songs like Be My Lover and Sweet Dreams. According to MTV, producer Frank Farian put the group together, pairing soulful Atlanta-born singer Melanie Thornton with rapper Lane McRae. Following 3 La Bouche albums, Thornton gave a solo career a try and even landed a hit in Germany with Ready to Fly. In November 2001, 2 days before the release of her follow-up single Wonderful Dream, Thornton died in an aviation accident. The singer was a passenger on a small plane that departed Berlin, Germany, bound for Zurich, Switzerland, where Thornton was scheduled to perform. Just before the plane could safely land, it crashed in a forest near the airport, according to the Associated Press. Thornton was among the 24 people on board who died. The singer was 33.